When the darkness falls, our time is at hand. We are the rulers of the night. We are the predators of the shadows. Come hither, and we will show you the true meaning of terror. Conrad von CARSTEIN, known by many names such as Conrad the Butcher, Conrad the Bloody, and Conrad the Beast, was an infamously violent and martial vampire count of Sylvania, known from the annals of history for his cruelty, corruption, and complete insanity. There are few things more dangerous than a violent lunatic, but one of them is an immortal violent lunatic with the strength and speed of a vampire. Adding a literal thirst for blood to Conrad's figurative mindset did little for the noble's stretched sanity. The first of the von CARSTEINs had considered this as a potential advantage, and Conrad was one of the last of the von CARSTEINs to be embraced into the family. Perhaps his complete lack of scruples and his tenuous grasp on reality amused Vlad and assured that he could never truly be a legitimate threat to his rule, unlike his deviously cunning son in darkness, Manfred. In retrospect, however, it might have better served his dynasty if Vlad had simply cut off Conrad's head when the chance first presented itself. His insane depravity resulted in far more harm than good for his dynasty. Once given the blood kiss, Conrad made no attempt to hide his supernatural powers and fed openly on his friends and subjects, as well as rats, cats, cows, wandering peddlers, and anything else with a pulse that came too close. Conrad appointed himself as something of a berserk enforcer for Vlad, executing anyone who displeased the Count. This naturally also included anyone who displeased Conrad. Over time, this encompassed many victims, including enemy generals, priests of all descriptions, people with a squint, and several necromancers who had laughed at Conrad's pitiful magical skills. The sun and the silver cannot harm us, not if we will them not to, not if we truly believe they will not. From Conrad von CARSTEIN. After their leader, Vlad von CARSTEIN was killed by the Grand Theatonist Wilhelm III at the siege of Altdorf. The surviving vampires fled back to Sylvania. 5 vampires claimed to be the heir of Vlad: Fritz, Hans, Peter, Conrad, and Manfred von CARSTEIN. For more than 40 years afterwards, the vampires of the von CARSTEIN line fought a vicious power struggle, giving the Empire vital time to recover from the desolation brought about by Vlad's invasion. In time, Fritz von CARSTEIN was killed on the field of battle, while foolishly attempting to besiege the mile-high fortress city of Middenheim. Hans von CARSTEIN perished when Conrad instigated a quarrel with him over who was the toughest among them. Peter was slain in his coffin by a vengeful witch hunter by the name of Helmut von Hall, a distant descendant of the vampire himself. It is said that Manfred von CARSTEIN had also aided in his death. After Peter's death, Manfred von CARSTEIN disappeared from Sylvania, leaving Conrad as the new, undisputed ruler of all Sylvania. In time, Conrad had purposefully enacted the Second Vampire War. Whilst Vlad von CARSTEIN was patient yet ambitious, Conrad von CARSTEIN was simply a mad butcher, evil, merciless, and insanely violent. Lacking the necromantic skills of his predecessor, he was forced to enslave any magicians he could capture and force them to do his bidding as powerful necromancers. Once more, the vampire counts of Sylvania rampaged across the lands of the Empire, bloodthirsty in their advance and showing no mercy. Indeed, Conrad is beyond bloodthirsty, even amongst his own kind. Whilst Vlad offered his opponents a choice between life and death, Conrad offered them a choice between dying quickly or dying slowly. Whilst Vlad's ambition was to rule as the vampire emperor of the Empire, Conrad's motive was to simply indulge himself in bloody violence. His war-mongering nature took his army far to the south, where he came into contact with the Knights of the Blood Keep and the bearers of the Blood Dragon bloodline. With these knights folding into his ranks, Conrad was able to destroy all those who would dare to oppose him. Despite his mediocre strategic planning, hysteria, and grave tactical errors. At Kleiberstorf, however, Conrad faced a powerful Avalander army that contained a massive battery of long-range artillery. When battle commenced, the Avalander artillery rained down barrage after barrage against the slow-moving Sylvanian army. In desperation, Conrad both threatened, bribed, and pleaded with his necromancers to keep his army moving forward. He offered power and riches to his captive wizards, and they acceded, combining their powers to unleash a scourging wind on the Avaland army. Dark magic swept across the Imperial ranks, and in short time, the Imperial soldiers began to feel their souls being clawed from ethereal hands. Panic began to spread as the unnatural gale began to slay more and more soldiers. In a moment of rare clarity, Conrad saw that the moment was ripe for an attack and sent forth his elite force of Blood Knights and Drakenhove Templars into the fray. Faced with insubstantial terrors and armored vampires, the Avaland army broke and fled. Conrad, like the bloodthirsty creature he is, hounded the Imperial soldiers for 5 days and 5 nights, ensuring that all those that had participated in the battle were hunted down and killed to the last. In his overzealous pride and need to draw more blood, the Vampire Count had instigated a bloody war with the dwarves against the cautious advice of his few counselors. Attacking isolated villages and surface settlements at the foothills of the mountain stronghold of Zufbar, the king of the hold itself had finally had enough and mustered a grand army to punish the vampire once and for all. Seeing a new challenge, the vampire met the dwarf army at the town of Nachthafen. In the battle, the dwarven runesmiths countered the necromantic spells of Conrad's enslaved necromancers with ease. Robbed of their sustaining power, the skeleton warriors and zombies of Conrad's army lay where they fell, blasted apart by a horrific barrage of cannons and mortar artillery. Conrad remained confident despite the setbacks and launched an all-out assault on the dwarves' right flank. Leading the assault himself, the vampire drove directly into the cadre of runesmiths, whilst his blood knight smashed into the disciplined ranks of dwarf warriors. Conrad slew the runesmiths personally, drinking their spilt blood and giving his captive necromancers the time they needed to resurrect the fallen. It was a hopeless battle, but the dwarves still fought stubbornly until the very end. Their own king had challenged the Blood Count in personal combat, but instead, Conrad dispatched Valach Harkon, the Grand Master of the Blood Knights, to fight as his champion. Though the duel was bitter close, the Grand Master finally killed the Dwarf King and gorged himself on the royal blood. Within the next hour, the dwarves were all dead. Conrad was so unwaveringly vicious in his undead assault that, confronted with a common enemy, the three claimants to the imperial throne had put aside their differences and combined their armies into one mighty force. At the Battle of the Four Armies, the three imperial grand armies united their forces against the undead army of Conrad just outside the fortress city of Middenheim. This battle became infamously known for the great betrayal enacted by the three imperial leaders. Emperor Ludwig and Empress Attila IV vied to assassinate each other during the battle, a disgusting gesture that forced the other imperial nobles to select another candidate to lead this new coalition. A conclave of the Elector Counts assembled themselves within Averheim, where they decided that Helmut of Marienburg would be a prime candidate to be the new emperor. Even as support for him grew within the council hall, Helmut began to act erratically, struck dumb and vacant at a critical time. In an infamous event, Helmut's skin began to peel off, and his eye suddenly popped out of his own skull. Even Helmut's son, Helmar, refused his father's claim to the throne once it was discovered that his father was killed and turned into a zombie under Conrad's control. With his ploy failing, Conrad threw into a rage and slaughtered his way from Averheim into the Howling Hills, putting to the torch every town and village that stood in his way. Finally, having had enough of Conrad's sadistic invasion, all of the remaining Elector Counts and Dwarf Lords joined forces once more upon the Battle of Grim Moor during the spring of 2121 IC. Arrogantly, Conrad once more attacked in a headlong charge against the fully arrayed armies of all the Elector Counts and the Dwarf Warriors under the legendary dwarf hero Grufbad. Although his Blood Knights were able to endure the punishment, a strange event began to occur. In that instant, the regiments of the undead began to falter, with the dark magic that bound them together being seeped away. It finally dawned that Conrad's necromancers had also had enough of Conrad's cruel rulership and betrayed him in that most critical moment. Seeing the battle as lost, the terrified Blood Knights fled the battlefield as well. In desperation, the magically inept Conrad tried to hold the undead army together, but the effort proved too much to bear, and in an instant, what little of Conrad's mind and sanity remained had finally snapped. In a mad fit, Conrad wandered away from the battle as his undead army began to disintegrate, shouting maniacally at this most cruelest of jokes. As Conrad wandered the forest aimlessly, Gruffbad captured Conrad and held him down while Elector Count Helmar impaled his father's killer with his runefang. With Conrad's death, the Second Vampire War was finally over, and in time, the Elector Counts began to squabble amongst themselves once more.